This is the story of the night Johnny Carson broke down on live television, and the letter from a dying father that brought the king of late night to his knees. On November 14, 1985, before an audience of 300 people and millions watching at home, a 7-year-old girl handed Johnny a piece of paper that would create 30 seconds of dead air, the longest silence in Tonight Show history. What was written on that paper reveals a secret connection between a janitor from Pasadena and the biggest star in America. Emily Warren was 7 years old, brown hair framing big eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. 8 weeks before that night, her father Michael had died at 34, a high school janitor in Pasadena, California, who wasn't rich and wasn't famous, but had one obsession that made him happy no matter how hard his day had been. And that obsession was The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Michael would sit in his worn-out recliner every single night with Emily on his lap, watching Johnny's monologue, knowing every joke and every gesture and every pause. He practiced Johnny's golf swing in their tiny backyard and repeated Johnny's punchlines at dinner until Emily's mother Karen rolled her eyes and laughed. Emily once asked him why he loved Johnny so much. Michael's answer was simple. "When I watch him, I forget that life is hard. He makes me believe that no matter how bad things get, there's always something to smile about." 3 months before his death, Michael did something crazy by entering a radio contest, calling in over 200 times in one weekend until he won 2 front-row tickets to a Tonight Show taping. The neighbors came running when he screamed, and he picked Emily up and spun her around the kitchen, telling her they were going to see Johnny front row, so close they could see him breathe. Emily had never seen her father so happy. September 15th changed everything when a drunk driver ran a red light on Colorado Boulevard and hit Michael's car on the driver's side, pronouncing him dead at the scene. Emily was supposed to go with him that day, but a last-minute cold kept her home, and she never got to say goodbye. What Michael left behind were the tickets, still in his nightstand, 2 front-row seats to The Tonight Show for November 14th, 1985, non-refundable and non-transferable, and one of them still had Michael's name printed on it. Karen didn't know what to do with them because throwing them away felt like throwing away the last piece of her husband's dream, but going without him seemed impossible. Emily made the decision for her by saying she wanted to go. Karen looked at her daughter, this tiny girl who hadn't smiled since the funeral, who barely ate, who woke up crying every night, calling for a father who would never come, and Karen told her it might be too sad. Emily shook her head and said that Daddy wanted to take her, and if they didn't go, his dream dies too, and she didn't want his dream to die. Karen broke down crying because her 7-year-old daughter was thinking more clearly than any adult in the room, and that's when they decided they would go. The night before the taping, Karen found Emily sitting on her bed holding a piece of paper, writing something carefully and slowly, concentrating hard on every word. Karen asked what it was. Emily folded the paper and put it in her pocket, saying it was for Johnny. Karen assumed it was a drawing, a child's thank you note, and she didn't push, but she should have. The night of the taping, Emily insisted on wearing her father's watch, even though it was too big for her wrist and she had to wrap tape around it just to keep it from falling off, but she wouldn't go without it. The drive to Burbank was silent with Emily sitting in the back seat, clutching that folded paper, staring out the window at the city lights her father would never see again. NBC Studios was electric when they arrived, people laughing and excited, the hottest ticket in television, but Emily didn't smile. Front row seats, the ones Michael had won, with one empty space beside them where he should have been, and Karen whispered that Daddy was watching from heaven. Emily nodded slowly and said she knew, and that's why she had to give Johnny the letter. Karen froze and asked what letter. "What did you write?" Before Emily could answer, the lights dimmed, and the band started playing, and Ed McMahon's voice boomed through the studio, announcing Johnny, and Johnny Carson walked through that curtain while Emily stood up, not to applaud, and not to cheer, but ready to deliver her father's final message. The monologue was going perfectly with Johnny on fire that night, political jokes landing and celebrity impressions getting huge laughs, the audience eating out of his hand. But something kept pulling Johnny's attention to a little girl in the front row who wasn't laughing and wasn't even smiling, just staring at him with an intensity that didn't belong on a child's face. Big brown eyes locked onto him like she was waiting for something. Johnny kept going because he was a professional, and he'd done this thousands of times, but every few seconds his eyes drifted back to her, to that oversized watch on her tiny wrist, to the way she was clutching that paper, to the empty seat beside her. Johnny finished his last joke, and the audience erupted in laughter, and in that brief moment of silence, the little girl stood up. Karen grabbed her arm and told her no, but Emily was already moving, walking toward the stage. Security stepped forward until Johnny held up his hand and told them to wait, to let her come. The audience went dead quiet as Johnny walked to the edge of the stage and knelt down to Emily's level, his knees cracking, and he didn't care. He asked her name. Her voice was tiny but steady when she said Emily, and that her daddy loved him. Johnny smiled warmly and told her that was very kind, asking if her daddy was there tonight. Emily shook her head and said he died 2 months ago in a car accident. The audience gasped, and Johnny's smile disappeared as he told her he was so sorry, that he was sure her daddy was watching from heaven. But Emily interrupted him. She held up the folded paper and said he wrote you a letter, that before he won the tickets he wrote this, and he said if he ever met Johnny, he wanted him to read it, but he never got to meet him, so she brought it for him. Johnny stared at the paper, then at Emily, then back at the paper, before taking it gently and unfolding it. The audience watched as Johnny Carson began to read, his face calm at first, professional, and then something shifted when his eyebrows pulled together and his lips pressed tight and his jaw clenched, and he kept reading. And that's when Johnny Carson's hands started trembling. Ed McMahon stood up and said Johnny's name while the director's voice came through the earpiece asking what was happening, but Johnny didn't respond because he couldn't, his eyes filling with tears as he tried to speak and nothing came out. The king of late night, the man who had entertained America for over 2 decades and had never broken character on live television, was crying, his shoulders shaking as he covered his mouth with his hand, and the letter trembled in his grip. 300 people sat in complete silence. Emily stepped closer and reached out and touched Johnny's hand, telling him that Daddy said he would understand, that he was the only person in the world who would understand. Johnny looked at her through his tears, his voice cracking, barely a whisper, saying her father's name and that he had no idea. 30 seconds of dead air, an eternity in television, the longest silence in Tonight Show history. Johnny looked at the audience, then at Emily, then at the 300 strangers waiting in breathless silence, and he took a deep breath and spoke, saying he needed to tell them something, needed to tell them who this little girl's father really was. He held up the letter and said the name Michael Warren, a janitor from Pasadena, a man he never met, but a man who just taught him something he'd never forget. Johnny's voice steadied as he read parts of the letter aloud, starting with the words that Mr. Johnny Carson didn't know him, but that he saved his life when he was 12 years old. The audience leaned forward. In 1955, Michael's father died in a factory accident in Nebraska, and he was lost, stopped talking, and stopped eating, and his mother didn't know what to do with him until one night she left the television on, and Johnny's show came on, and he watched the monologue, and for the first time in 3 months, he laughed. Johnny's voice cracked. "That laugh saved me," the letter said, "reminding me that joy could exist even when everything hurt, and I've watched your show every single night since then, 30 years, and you've been there for me when no one else was." Johnny paused and wiped his eyes. "And now, I'm dying." The audience gasped. Johnny continued reading about the cancer, about the doctors saying he had a few months, but he wasn't scared because Johnny taught him that even in the darkest night, there's always a reason to smile, and he wouldn't get to meet Johnny, but his daughter would, and please tell her that her daddy loved her, and please tell her that laughter is how we survive. Johnny lowered the letter and looked at Emily, telling her that her father didn't die in that car accident by chance, that he was already sick and knew he didn't have much time, and his final wish wasn't for himself, but for her. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Johnny knelt down again and held both her hands, telling her that her daddy spent his whole life learning how to smile through pain, and now he wants her to learn the same thing, not because life isn't hard, but because laughter is how we keep going. Emily whispered that he really loved Johnny. Johnny nodded and said he really loved him too, even though they never met, because anyone who understands what laughter really means is family to him. Johnny stood up, but he wasn't finished, and he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his signature pocket square, navy blue with white edges, the same one he'd worn for over a decade. He folded it carefully and placed it in Emily's hands, telling her he wanted her to have it, that every night he does this show he wears one of these, and whenever she misses her daddy, hold this and remember that somewhere out there, someone is trying to make people smile just like her father wanted. Emily clutched it like it was made of gold. Johnny walked her back to Karen, who was sobbing and unable to speak. And Johnny leaned in and whispered that her husband was a hero and Emily was going to be just fine. He turned to the audience and told them they were going to take a short break, but he wanted them to remember something that night, that the people who love us never really leave. They just find new ways to reach us. And Michael Warren reached him tonight through a letter, and the bravest little girl he'd ever met. The audience erupted into a standing ovation with 300 strangers crying and clapping, some hugging each other. During the commercial break, Johnny asked his producer to bring Emily and Karen backstage after the show, and when they arrived, Johnny had one more gift, a framed photo of himself signed personally. The inscription read, "For Emily and Michael Warren, your daddy taught me something tonight. Keep laughing forever. With love, Johnny Carson." Johnny made a promise after that, telling Emily that every year on her birthday he was going to dedicate a joke to her father, so wherever she was, she'd know that someone remembers him. Johnny kept that promise every single year until the day he retired. Emily Warren is 46 years old today, working as a grief counselor in Los Angeles and specializing in helping children who have lost parents, using her father's story every day to show them that healing is possible. On her office wall hangs Johnny's pocket square in a gold frame with the signed photograph next to it, and beside that, a copy of her father's letter. She still wears Michael's watch, and it fits now. Every year on her birthday, Emily watches old Tonight Show reruns and tells her patients the same thing Johnny told her that night, that laughter isn't about forgetting pain, it's about surviving it. Johnny Carson died in 2005, and when Emily heard the news, she wrote a letter to his widow Alexis, and a month later Alexis replied, saying that Johnny never forgot her, that he talked about that night often, that he said her father's letter reminded him why he did what he did for 30 years. Not to be famous, but to help people smile when smiling felt impossible. Emily's daughter is 7 years old today, the same age Emily was that night, and they watched the tape together last year after NBC had given Emily a digital copy decades ago. Her daughter asked if Johnny really cried,